Welcome to Sharks, Snakes, and Shareholders, an Innovators Uncensored show where startup founders and entrepreneurs share their horror stories of shady term sheets, toxic boardrooms, and investors you wish you declined. Each week, we'll have a new guest, ranging from angel investors and VCs to deal makers and founders, who will rank each of these horror stories on our investor red flag scale. Hosted by ShipShape.VC's very own Daniel Salko.
Hi, I'm Daniel Safko. I'm the CEO and co-founder of ShipShape.VC, a free-to-use investment search engine that enables founders to identify which investors they should be speaking with about the technology that they're building. We're really pleased about this show because it helps founders identify the horror stories that other founders have gone through without needing to repeat the same mistakes themselves. Welcome, Sam, to sunny Newport. It's great to have you here. You are a serial founder. You've had a very significant exit. You now run a company called Founder Catalyst, and you help founders with essentially their legal paperwork to help them get advanced assurance, amongst other things. Have I missed anything? Are you happy to sort of share a bit more about yourself and background?
Yeah, for sure. And lovely to be here. Thanks for the invite so much and the lovely lunch. I guess so. I've been every side of the table and I see lots and lots of deals. Let me break that apart. So yeah, I've been a founder myself. I grew a tech company 0 to 30 million in 4 years and then exited to private equity, which sounds like it was a field of roses, the way I say it like that. But as with every founder journey, it was far less than linear. It was a real roller coaster. But anyway, that was really, really great. I started angel investing pretty much as soon as I exited. I've got 33 investments now over the last 8 years, and not all of those have been great either. Some really, really great. One notable exit. But yeah, lots of stories I could share there. But also I see thousands of transactions with my Founder Catalyst hat on. So we support lots of founders achieve SEI, SEIS advanced assurance, close funding rounds, and put in place incentive schemes to incentivize employees, advisors, and so on. So in my travels with all those hats on, I get to see thousands of transactions, and we could fill up every podcast episode you want to do based upon some of those stories. But I think we've got 3 really interesting ones to pick on today to start with.
Yeah, and it'd be great if you can bring some of that experience. As we go through and analyze some of these, that would be fantastic. And yeah, thanks very much for joining. And just before we crack on and get into the meat of the matter and the stories that have been sent in, thank you, by the way, actually to the founders who've sent through their investor horror stories. One of the key things that we want to do with this podcast is ultimately go through scenarios that founders have been through previously, and ultimately help other founders who might be going through things for the first time build pattern recognition of what warning signs they could potentially look out for, so that actually they avoid anything bad happening to them and their business. Okay, so format is we'll go through the 3 questions, and we then actually have a ranking system. So at the end of each story, we will go through a system where we basically rank the severity of that scenario for the founder. So first one is oddball alert. So that's where actually you're, it's the 1K investor who's got a due diligence checklist, 100 questions long. That's actually meant for a company that's potentially going public or something. Next up, we have the backseat founder. So that's when an investor is looking to get far too involved in the business, really for it to be good. Next up, we have the boardroom vampire. So they're going to really make it an absolute pain as you go forward. They're going to really be an anchor and a drag on the business, and the terms that they're setting really aren't going to be helpful at all. Lastly, business butcher. So that's where if you accept the terms that are on offer, actually you've killed the business, or indeed the scenario that you're in with that particular investor. It's so bad that actually the business is likely to be at risk. Cool.
That sounds like a good scheme.
Great. And if we disagree, that's absolutely fine. We might have our own separate reasons, but disagreement, no bad thing.
Yep.
Okay, right. Let's get cracking. So founder submission number 1. So we had an investor who offered to do, and I will, in quotation marks, investor, as it's been written here, who offered to do free legal work in return for shares in the company. However, they refused to accept any cliff or vesting schedule with regards to those shares, and demanded all of the equity up front before they even started any work. got to say, I've not come across that particular scenario before with an investor or indeed advisor where they've asked for something up front. But is that something that you've seen previously in your engagements with founders where they've gone through that scenario?
Yeah, I've seen this happen quite a few times, and quite often it goes badly, as you can imagine. Maybe it's worth taking a step back and looking at what kind of motivation you've got on both sides of the table here in this kind of scenario. So, if you're the founder, you want the job done well, and you want to, you've agreed a set of shares, and you want to allocate those shares to the advisor once they've done the job well. And you don't want to do it beforehand, because there is a nightmare scenario where you allocate the shares, there's no vesting in place. It sounds like that lawyer has already indicated this, but there's no vesting in place. The advisor wanders off, and you've given away equity that you can in no way withdraw legally, and that would be a problem. So that's the founder's point of view. The advisor has kind of the opposite point of view, which is what they don't want to do is do a great job and then be left without the shares or whatever afterwards. However, if you turn this into a kind of money situation rather than a share situation, it would be typical for a founder to pay on completion of the work. They would pay the lawyer once they've done what they need to do, rather than paying them in advance.
Yeah, you'd never pay a builder up front for all the work that's going to be done to a property, right?
I've just started building work on my house. That's a sore subject, and they did try. No, of course you wouldn't. So yeah, I think the dynamics are clear. Neither party, it's about managing your risk, and that's different on both sides. I think the problem with this story is there's a horrible power imbalance between the two parties. The founder isn't a lawyer, doesn't understand probably how to play the game and what reasonable looks like. The lawyer understands exactly how to play the game. They know how to de-risk. And the reality is, if the founder gives the shares to the investor, in inverted commas, then they're not going to sue the lawyer to get those shares back if the lawyer doesn't deliver anything, because who sues a lawyer? That's absolutely ridiculous. The standard way to de-risk for both parties here is to put vesting in place, really, where you either have a legally binding agreement, so a contract where the lawyer could draw this up trivially. The contract would say the lawyer's going to do X, Y, and Z. When it's all signed off, they will get equity of Y. That's really, really standard and really straightforward. And the fact the lawyer's not willing to do that, it's a one-page document, makes you wonder what their motivation is.
I guess just on that point, like someone coming in and wanting to completely de-risk their commitment into a business for a founder who inherently both parties know that there's an inherent risk involved here, right? And granted, the lawyer might turn around and say, well, your business might fail, my shares could be worth nothing. That's the reason why you should help de-risk the investment and commitment I'm making here. But so like you've got a potential schedule where ultimately like the lawyer in an ideal scenario, and I think the balance scenario here, the founder and the lawyer agree exactly what you just said with regards to upon completion. But why what other options does the founder have in this scenario, thinking just about getting legal advice over a period of time?
Yeah, I mean, there's no magic wand to lawyers, and we see this all the time where founders realise they need a lawyer but don't want to pay £400-500 an hour, and there's no nice way around that. I think there are, shameless plug alert, there are platforms such as Founder Catalyst which allow people to avoid using lawyers entirely most of the time. 95% of our funding rounds go through without a lawyer being either side of the transaction, and that's a nice way of avoiding £400 an hour legal fees. Sometimes you can get, you can do work for equity where lawyers support you and get equity in return. I don't see that often. That's pretty rare. Generally, it's more, it's different types of advisors that would do that. Or, you can have a retainer or something like that. But, lawyers are in business in order to get their hourly fees. So there's not too many ways to skin a cat there.
I suppose any and the clear warning sign that you take away from this is actually someone wanting everything up front in return for services that ultimately have to be performed in the future. Is that where you see the risk?
Yeah, because and the risk for the founder is they allocate the equity, they file the SHO1 with Companies House, they give the share certificate and go, great, when are you going to start work? And the lawyer all of a sudden ghosts them or doesn't deliver any work. And I know I've seen some founders, some Founder Catalyst customers, in fact, who have done exactly this. They've allocated. You've got to kind of, when you're allocating shares, you're incentivizing to advisors specifically. I mean, you're either incentivizing, you're saying thank you for people for work they've already done, and that's fine. There's no risk there. They've already done it. You're giving them a pat on the back and some shares to say thanks. The risk comes in when you're allocating shares for something to be done, and you've got as soon as the shares have gotten, there's no way they're rescinding them or whatever. You're subject to, you could potentially sue a lawyer. You're never going to do that. It takes 50 grand plus to take somebody to court. It's just not worth it for the shareholding. There is also a question of delta here. So how many shares are you giving? If you're giving 1% of your shares to a lawyer to do some work, I mean, that's really expensive in long-term view potentially, but it's not catastrophic if you get it wrong. If you were giving 10% to a lawyer for, doing the funding round and loads of IP work and, 5 years of commitment in the future, your risk profile is much higher because that's a meaningful amount of shares.
Okay. So let's say founders, listen to this, first time founder, I suppose, what would you say is the key takeaway here is just don't engage, don't engage in any commitment that is where you're basically de-risking everything for the other side, but you're taking all the risk yourself. Because in this instance, yeah, in theory, the lawyer doesn't do it. Founder basically doesn't have the work performed that they need, and yeah, business is in real trouble potentially because they've made an investment in a service that isn't performed.
Yeah, I think the real trouble may overstate. I mean, but effectively, you're giving away equity for something you'll never receive. It's not like you're out of pocket financially, but the equity, hopefully has a huge, meaningful value moving forward. I think, as a principle and as a starting point, the founder should be giving equity to say thank you for doing something, not in advance of doing something, because there genuinely is, other than going to courts, there's no way of pulling those shares back unless you have vesting or something similar in place.
Any other lessons that you think founders can take from that?
I mean, it would be a red flag for me that somebody is negotiating as aggressively. This is not a lawyer. They're just after their best interest. They're not even thinking of the founder's interest at all. So I would just walk away from the relationship. It feels predatory, to be honest, doesn't it?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And having that, I think even if I had that at the start of our journey, it would have felt pretty messed up. So yeah, hopefully, well, I think that founder didn't end up pursuing that type of relationship. So well on them,
Yeah.
and hopefully others, probably would have spotted that too. Let's move on to assessing where this fits in terms of. I'm gonna put that down. I mean, I'm gonna go with the orange for that one, but I don't know.
Yeah, I was thinking. Yeah, no, I don't think it's a catastrophic. As long as the percentages are small, I don't think it's a catastrophic mistake to make. And there are lots of schemes out there that are really hard to spot. I think this one is really easy to spot. It's just a basic principle of not paying for something in advance, whether it's equity or cash, before you get it.
I think, yeah, in my case, I just was thinking, okay, well, actually, if the founder did sign up to that arrangement, that deal, what type of signal would that potentially send down the line in terms of other investors who are thinking about getting involved, but potentially see the terms of such a contract? But yeah, I think that sounds fair enough. Okay, so founder sort of horror story number 2. After speaking to an investor for months, with that investor sort of saying that they were keen to get involved. They eventually got to due diligence, and it took a long time, much longer than this founder had experienced previously. And then eventually, this investor basically said like they weren't interested in investing in the company anymore because they didn't see enough grey hairs, essentially in the business. So just didn't think that the founders and the company had enough experience. And yeah, I suppose interesting in this scenario is if you're a founder hearing that, you could say, well, actually, you could have noticed at the very beginning that there weren't enough grey hairs in the company. But yeah, we'd love to hear like what's your view on that? Have you heard of that happen previously?
Yeah, there is a lot to unpack on this one. As an investor myself, I can put myself in the investor's position, and God, where to start? So, let's start with what's actually going on in the investor's head. Let's start there, and then we can work about how you mitigate this specific circumstance. But to take a step back, investors are in a difficult position when they've committed to an investment, but actually they get cold feet for whatever reason. Do they ghost the founder, which is bad form? Do they make an excuse that maybe that this is an excuse? Have they found something else during due diligence? Have they identified that actually this is much harder than they thought? Have they noticed, they've scratched the surface, they've got to meet the founders and gone, actually, you guys you don't have the experience or the capability that I thought you did to see this to the end. So, so I think there are lots of reasons by which a founder can change their mind. And like I say, they can either, just ghost the founder, they can make a feeble excuse, or they can be brutally honest with the feedback. Now, I'm a massive fan, if you've seen any of my pitch deck reviews, they are, completely transparent and honest, and I like to cut to the chase. And I think in this scenario, I'd probably be, honest with founders. But there are really interesting examples where founders have had, the founder has called it brutal and excessive feedback from an investor, and they've shamed the investor on Twitter for providing what I thought was actually constructive and actionable feedback. So quite often investors, I tell you what, I don't want any drama. I'm just going to go to the most plausible excuse so I can get out of this cleanly. So it may be that the underlying reason had nothing to do with grey hair, and there was another reason they just didn't want to dive into it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And let's go into that a bit further. And why, from an investor dynamics perspective, investors care about receiving deal flow. Hopefully that's relevant, but certainly plenty of it. And let's take the example of the founder shaming an investor on Twitter for the feedback that they received. That investor has gone out of their way. They've taken time out of a busy schedule to give that feedback. But actually, the downstream impact for that investor is probably less deal flow, because that founder will have badmouthed that investor to their network, and ultimately
openly on Twitter. Yeah.
Well, yes, yeah, exactly.
Look at it the other way. There's very little upside to an investor giving any feedback. And in this, what's double amazing, the investor gave detailed, actionable insights, and he didn't sugarcoat it, but it wasn't brutal at all. And said, if you can fix these, come back and have a conversation. So left the door open as well, which was rudely slammed by the founder. But if I'm an investor, what benefit is there to me giving the founder any feedback if A, it's going to take some time, B, I could be publicly shamed for it, and C, that'll impact my future deal flow? There is no upside really, other than it being kind of the right thing to do. So it's a really interesting dynamic.
I think when you look at it through that lens, getting a piece of feedback like not enough grey hairs in the company starts making a bit more sense in terms of actually what's something here that I can say that's sort of almost certainly true in this case, but actually stops the investor needing to dive into deeper reasons in terms of the company. Because if they're doing the due diligence that they say that they're doing across that time frame that the founder has said, it's not going to take them that long to arrive at the conclusion of the grey hairs bit. It's going to be something else that they found really in that scenario.
Yeah. So that was, the example I gave, it was just an excuse for getting out of the process. I think, maybe if we spend some time focusing on what does the grey hair comment, what does that mean when an investor says that? I think that's an interesting thought process. And, typically it means exactly what it says in the tin. This, they would expect more senior people with more experience sat around the table than actually did exist. Which is interesting, because you would, the founders would argue, well, you saw us pitch, you've had some initial conversations, we've had a coffee, you've met all of us, who sat around the table.
The hair colour.
Yeah, our hair colour. So you kind of knew what you were getting into. But, the process of taking on investment is building a relationship between the founder and the investor. And the investor will naturally get to know you during due diligence. Due diligence is about rifling through numbers and digging into all the detail, but it's also building that relationship between the two people. And actually, the investor may uncover that the people around the table didn't have the experience that either, their LinkedIn, we all embellish a little on LinkedIn, I'm sure, but,
all right, Chancellor.
now. yeah, the LinkedIn may be embellished a bit, or you gave an amazing polished pitch because you've done it a million times, and actually, when you scratch under the surface, everybody isn't carrying that level of experience that the founder was expecting, or they've started digging into the the product roadmap and where it is now and how much work's to do, and they've realised, well, actually, there's some holes in the team that weren't obvious from the presentation and the initial conversations. And one thing a founder needs to bear in mind is the deal's not done until the deal's done, right? Even though you sign a term sheet, that's not to any reasonable extent legally binding. So, you've got to get all the way through to signing the shareholder agreement or the investment agreement or whatever, and that's where the deal's done.
Well, or indeed money in the bank, because sometimes, until that's done, there's still, still deal is not necessarily complete. Taking this from a founder perspective, so this has evidently taken a lot of time.
Yep.
The founder probably was banking on some of this. It basically, going into the story, like it said that the investor said they were very keen to get involved. They might have allocated a percentage chance and probability of this, and given the amount of due diligence that they've talked about being conducted, this has been sucking up business time in that entire process. So, what are some good ways of founders avoiding getting too sucked into a process like that? And have you seen any methods employed to help stop that?
I mean, the first thing to say, and this is fairly obvious, is, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Just because you've got one investor who seems interested, you should carry on other conversations in parallel, because, anybody could drop out at any stage. What you don't want to do is go back to square one, or you don't want to have 5 investors interested. You've got one who's your ideal investor who can bring, an active angel who can open doors, and they're giving all the money you need, and and then find they fall away, and the other 4 have gone as well. So make sure you haven't got any exclusivity arrangements in the term sheet or whatever. But I think keep all investors in play until you know that deal's over the line, and that allows you to restart the process, or continue the process with everybody, and make a decision right at the end rather than earlier.
It was that competitive tension as well. You can leverage off that to your advantage, obviously, both in terms of the deal terms, but also making sure that actually, let's take that most interested investor. You want to be sending the strongest possible signal that they've made the right call.
Yeah.
So if you can talk to the fact that you've got other investors interested, that also doesn't just help you get the best price, but it also makes the deal more certain, right? In terms of keeping those others engaged,
and gives you a plan B if the investor falls away, you're not starting, you're not getting back to the Rolodex. And the fact, it's a really bad look with my investor hat on. If I see a round is nearly going to close and then collapses because investors walk away, you're like, well, why did that happen? What did they find in due diligence? What was that's a real red flag to investors when you see other investors walking away, having spent, because don't forget, the investor spent a lot of time doing due diligence as well. Investors are typically very busy people, and they wouldn't invest that time unnecessarily. So the fact they have spent all of that time and then walk away, that's like,
quite the red
awkward
flag. Yeah. Well, actually, just on that point, if you're the founder, how much do you communicate or not communicate about exactly that happening with the other investors?
I mean, if all the investors are, shoulder to shoulder through the process, it would be visible, and you've got to make the best light out of it. And potentially your investors are all talking because they're all sharing DD or whatever. For other investors that are maybe lagging a little in the process, then you can, they're going through a divorce, or, they've just had to sell the house, or whatever it is. There's always some other plausible excuse. But quite often, if your investors are all in the round, then they might be talking anyway. And that's unavoidable. I mean, if we look for a second, it'd be interesting to turn to the underlying reason that the investor came up with in this example is grey hair. And I mean, I guess the next question is, how would you, if in this specific scenario, if that was the problem, how do you mitigate against that? Although I think you and I are both dubious that was the underlying reason. I mean, you can't change your founding team. If there's 4 of you, 4 25-year-olds all straight out of university who are in a business, you can't magically create some grey hair. You're not going to add a 5th founder just to do that. But what you can do is add people around the team to add grey hair and, to produce a well-rounded team. There's a really lovely saying, individuals don't need to be well-rounded, teams do. And that's the founding team. Ideally, as an investor, I want to see some grey hair. Ideally, I want to see diversity in all its shapes and forms. So it's not just a specific type of individual replicated on the board. And I want to see, the go-getter salesperson. I want to see the deep technical person. I want to see the person who worries about P&L and balance sheet. I want to see, all of those different aspects in the business. But if you haven't got any of that, either the diversity or the age, or you haven't got each of those skills, you can add advisors to plug gaps that you will naturally add at some point in the future. So early stage startups don't often have an FD. It's probably the last role to be added to the team. But there's no reason why you don't get somebody with a finance or accountancy background who could be a NED or an advisor or a chairman or whatever, that potentially adds some grey hair. It also fills one of the gaps you've got, and it will cost you very little in terms of equity.
What's a good way of a founder teasing out that might be that sort of the level of experience in the team might need bolstering? What's a good way of a founder teasing that out from an investor in terms of that being a consideration for them without jeopardizing the deal?
And this goes back to the point we were making earlier, where investors are, sometimes loath to give any kind of feedback that is critical, because they're going to get shamed on Twitter. Send me your pitch deck. I'll give you, for anybody listening to this, I will give you brutally honest feedback. I'll try and sell you our services at Founder Catalyst, but we will give you feedback on your pitch deck and tell you, where the gaps, where we think the gaps are. Find yourself a friendly angel investor that you can take for a beer and walk through the deck, and that you're not trying to sell to, that probably won't ever invest in you. Ideally, you want to find somebody early on who's like, yeah, this isn't for me, and you can say, actually, if I buy you lunch, can you be brutally honest on our pitch deck and give me that feedback across? And the team's just one, as you know, Daniel, the team's just one small aspect of it. You want feedback across the board. But on the team specifically, I've just given you all the guidance I think you need, which is, have you got all the boxes ticked? Have you got some diversity? And if not, have you got advisors that patch up those holes? And if I can give you one war story from my investment days, I saw a lovely company. I won't name them. They had a very strong academic team. So, a CTO with a PhD and was professor of totally relevant. And I loved the idea. I loved the potentially green impact, but the thought of an academic running a startup fills me full of dread, because they're really strong in one of the disciplines we spoke about, but who's going to come up with a go-to-market strategy? Who's going to kick down the doors of partners? Who's going to manage the compliance and the regulatory stuff? That is not going to be somebody with a PhD, or not typically. And actually, what I really, really loved, the academic recognized this and found two very, very seasoned founders who joined him on the mission. And there was a CEO and a COO, already exited businesses with really, really great CVs, and then a CTO who was top of his field as well. And that's perfect. I think that's the perfect blend.
I guess actually from an investor perspective, the fact that the founder recognizes that and actually sought to fill those gaps from a future sort of backability perspective, that's got to be such a good signal.
Oh yeah, it goes from strength to strength. Exactly.
Brilliant. Okay, all right. So we'll move on, I think, to sort of assessing the situation. So thinking about it from a founder perspective, like how detrimental is this potentially for the business? So yeah, we'll do that on our sort of color scale.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're going to be different here, because
yeah, I think so. So I think it depends on how the founders played it, right? But
exactly. Yeah. I've got two cards, because it's red or green, right? It's, if the founders looked for multiple investors in parallel and managed the process sensibly, they should get away with it, and they'll kind of learn a lesson. If they've put all their eggs in one basket and they've got nowhere else to, and they're going to run out of money, and they've wasted their time with one investor, it's that one, isn't it? It's
yeah.
It's pretty binary.
You're right. It's binary, and therefore I went with a blend. Yeah, no, I think you're right. Like, I think hopefully this founder did have other options on the table, and either that or a lot of runway, which you can argue about whether that was efficient use of time. But yeah, like it's an unfortunate scenario, and I think quite a lot of founders will eventually end. Like, something like that will happen to most founders. in terms of getting into a process and someone finding something that they just didn't like or they couldn't get comfortable with. Yeah.
And there's something beautiful to be said. I know people like, one big investor putting all the money in. There's a massive risk there. Where if you've got 10 investors putting 25K in, great. If one investor walks away, the round doesn't collapse. If you are taking money from a fund, an SEIS or EIS fund, who are putting all of the money in, or the vast majority, or you've got this one angel who's putting a super big check in, the potential impact of one investor walking away is much, much larger.
I think we had like 2.5, nearly 3 years ago now. We had a scenario where 400K of a 650K round basically collapsed. And actually, you mentioned earlier around it was a family office that basically had told us they were setting up a fund in the UK, and actually all legals were signed, subscription agreement, everything, like all legals were signed,
Right.
including the commitment to wire the money over within, I think it was like three business days, and it didn't happen. We were very lucky that we had other investors that were still happy to proceed with the round, and it was treated as an interim rather than anything else. But yeah, that could have quite
Could have
easily
been
killed the business.
catastrophic.
Yeah, and we didn't build enough. We definitely didn't build enough optionality with regards to the main contribution to that round. Yeah, lesson learned.
There we are.
Yeah. Okay, right. So moving on to third and final. Actually, just before we do, I'm going to do a quick shout out for thank you very much to the founders who contributed their stories. If you're a founder and you've gone through a really negative scenario with investors, either just in the initial phase of an investment or actually as the investment's gone on, or even after an investment, we want to hear from you so that other founders can avoid the same situation scenario. Okay, so final story. We had one investor who was so hands-on that they wouldn't actually let the founders do their jobs. So whenever the founding team wanted to delegate a task down to a team member, so this was discussed at a board, that investor would force the founders to let that investor do that task. Very unusual scenario. It's rare to get people volunteering to do such things. Have you come across scenarios like that in terms of investors getting so hands-on so as to be sort of interfering in the day-to-day running?
Yes. So usually when we're talking about investor types, you talk about passive investors who, comes to the end of the tax year, they've just paid 100, the banker types from London, you got a, £500,000 tax bill and they throw some into an SEIS investment. Don't ever expect them to add any value at all. Then you get the active investors, which I think is, exactly where you want to be. People who will make correct introductions to suppliers or customers or partners, whatever it happens to be, or they will bring some other skill that, maybe the lawyer, without being a crook, the lawyer who can potentially bring, some knowledge and provide support to the startup without being on the clock all the time. And then I think you've got the super version of an active investor, not in a good way, not super good, where they are taking a role well beyond what the remit of an arm's length angel investor should be. With the obvious challenges that have been caused in this case.
How do you establish that boundary early? So let's say you're a founder going through this the first time. How do you establish that quickly with an investor?
So, well, let's take a step back on the legal front first. So let's talk about how who has influence in a startup formally, because you mentioned a board here. So I am guessing that the person who invested became an investor director, which means they're a statutory director, means they sit on the board. It means it's one person, one vote with a majority passes. So that really matters. If you've got two founders and an investor director, actually they could just outvote him on everything, but that would create, that wouldn't be the most pleasant working relationship when you're falling out with your investor. But the legality works that way. But let's walk through I think there's a few areas to unpack. So firstly, you get shareholder resolution. So every shareholder in a business, as long as they carry voting shares, they can vote. And you get one share, one vote. And typically investors will own 5% of shares if they're lucky. In order to pass the highest level of resolution, a special resolution, you need 75% of shareholdings to agree.
This is UK law.
UK, yeah, under Companies Act, and this is all enshrined in law. You can't override this in the articles or whatever. So Yeah, so usually your investors won't hold, at least for the first couple of rounds or at the first round, they won't own more than 25%. Therefore, they can't block a special resolution, and therefore they don't actually have a lot of say in the business from a shareholder voting point of view. When you come to second and third rounds, quite often the founding team's diluted below the 75% ownership and sometimes below the 50% for an ordinary resolution. But like very early days in a startup, the founders virtually always have all of the control via those resolutions by shareholder voting. You then get board voting, and the only way that an investor can get board voting is if you appoint them to the board. And the way to do that is something called an investor director, where they're registered on Companies House as a director, and like I say, they attend every board meeting, they vote on every vote, and it's typically they wouldn't have a casting vote or whatever. It's one board member, one vote. So that's pretty straightforward. In this case, I'm guessing there was more than one founder. Sometimes, quite often there is, and therefore they could outvote. They could tell that investor to get back in their box. But it's trying to keep that harmonious relationship working. The third level of control that you quite often see are investor consents, and this gives a veto right on certain actions in a company. So even if you've got a 75% majority from the founders, even if they control the board entirely, there are some things that an investor will reasonably want to have a say on. Things like closing down the company, giving each of the directors a big loan, changing the director's salary, allowing the directors to sell shares, potentially doing a funding round or taking on debt. There's quite a big chunk of a list of things that are meaningful to the company that the investors believe they should have a say in, and that's something called an investor consent.
And there are some, and my understanding is that you can set the threshold by which someone who owns shares is considered an investor.
Yeah, I mean, usually it's pretty black and white. Anybody who's the founder is out there for the purpose of investor consent. You need 50% of investor shareholdings to agree, and the founder share, something founders don't often understand, they don't vote in that process. They're not an investor, therefore they can't give investor consent. Therefore, the 50% is the shareholding owned by the investors. And the shareholder agreement articles will make it really clear what that threshold is. And it's, like I say, it's usually 50%. And maybe this investor had the majority of the investor shares and therefore had some clout by virtue of this. It sounds like there is the problem here probably isn't legal, though. It's a power dynamic thing where, maybe it was an investor director sat on the board and had very, very strong opinions of how the business should do certain things.
Let's say you're the founder. How do you try and suss out that an investor is going to be like that?
I mean, the first thing you can do is not let them on the board, and unless they're putting in a meaningful, let's put it this way, I've got 33 investments now. I've invested, just shy of £1 million, and I'm not an investor director on any of those businesses at all. And I've never wanted to be. I've never asked to be. There is a funny, funny power dynamic where an investor even asks for that. It's fairly unusual, and not least because you pick up fiduciary duties. You have some legal risk when you become a statutory director in a company, even if you're an investor director. So I would never rush to do that. Across 33 companies, that would be very brave indeed.
So someone throwing themselves in for that sort of role, immediately you should be asking some questions as a founder.
Yeah, and quite often when I see this happening, it will be an investor put in. If there's a 250k funding round, that investor will be putting 200 of that in, and they'll be like, "Well, I'm the biggest investor. I'm going to be on the board." And I'm trying to think. Yeah, in lots of occasions where I've seen this, it has not gone well ultimately because there is there's a strange dynamic between that investor and the board, and I can think of quite a few scenarios where it's ended badly.
I would definitely say that we've got a contrary example where we our NED Hugh, hello, we've got a great working relationship with, did invest the quite significantly larger sum in a previous funding round, and got a very good working relationship, but ultimately kind of lets Alistair and I get on with running the business.
Yep.
Which very different sort of working relationship, and get stuck in if need be, but otherwise happy to let us get on with that. And it's just through our own process of assessing, okay, is this individual someone that we would want to get involved in the
Mm.
business? Uh, Asking other companies that they've invested in, that was a really great step to be able to take, and actually, previously covered. If an investor doesn't want to share who's in their portfolio that they've been working with previously, like that's a huge red flag. I do wonder whether or not these founders asked, "Where have you done this elsewhere?" and can we go have a chat
Yeah.
with those companies? Which
Yeah.
actually, if you're in the UK, you can find out on Companies House, so you can see if an investor has been a board member elsewhere, um, and potentially go have a chat with those companies.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
You've got to think, this the relationship between a founder and investor on both sides is a very long term commitment that is very hard to get out of. It's it's worse than dating. Dating, you go, yeah, this isn't working, I'm out. Actually, you've got legally binding commitment over a period, and the more rights you give your investor, so certainly board rights and things like that, the harder they can make life. And in a couple of the scenarios I've spoken about, the business has literally, the founders have just closed the business to get away from a toxic relationship. And how do you avoid that? Well, don't make people who are just putting in those big tickets for a pre-seed funding round, don't make them investor directors. Sure, make them a board observer, give them information access, give them information rights, give them regular updates. But once they're an investor director, it's really, really, really hard to unseat them. If you can get away with it, don't give them investor consents. Although with my investor hat on, I always fight for them, and I can give you some great stories on why. Yeah, so I think that just don't assume everything's going to work out. Plan for if this relationship goes a bit sour and how do you manage it? Because, in any of my investments, I haven't got investor consents in quite a few of them. I've got a very small percentage, and I'm not an investor director. I'm not a director of any kind. And if I fall out with the founders, they'll just shrug and go, "What are you going to do?" And they have a very good point. I've got no teeth because, legally that's the way the contract's built. But as soon as you give that investor director thing, that's really hard to unseat.
Anything else to unpick, do you think, from that particular story?
I mean, it sounds like from that story, it sounds like there's a requirement for a grown-up conversation between the founder and investor and say, right, we've noticed this behavior. We want you to add value, from a founder's point of view. We want you to add value in these different ways. We'd really love you to contribute here. And wouldn't it be great if you were introducing us to partners, or could you solve this specific problem? As we scale, you're not going to be able to do everything in the business. So we want to play you to your strengths, make it an ego play, make it a nice, there's two ways to approach this, isn't there? There's, buyout, we don't want you, or there's we want to play you to your strengths. We think you'll add really great value here. I would try doing it that way. And if that doesn't work, have the other conversation, which is, look, this is detrimental. You're being a distraction a hindrance rather than da-da-da-da-da.
Are there, I mean, much like there are marriage sort of dispute advisors and to try and help you sort of work through that, are there similar types of advisory services that companies can engage?
Absolutely not. No, you're on your own. I mean, you can, you can speak to a lawyer or whatever, but yeah, there's no, you're kind of on your own here. What you may have, if you've got a couple of, this is why it's good having an advisory, a NED, a chairman, and if you've got a broader team, then the founders can delegate that really awful conversation to one of the other advisors and say, look, Jimmy on the board's being a bit disruptive and these are the behaviors we want to, could you go and have a chat? And then the founder can step away, preserve their relationship with the kind of toxic board member and let somebody else have that conversation. That's a really good use of advisors to manage those kind of board relationships.
It's really interesting. Yeah, sound advice. Thank you very much, Sam. Okay, I think that we're probably ready to move on to voting on that one and where we think that sits in.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it may be in this, in some scenarios, it could be catastrophic. In some scenarios, it could be benign. We don't know much about this one.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, like that. I mean, it is the definition of a backseat founder, and
yeah,
hopefully not too disruptive and detrimental to the business. But I think the longer that type of relationship goes on, the more detrimental it could possibly be. Or hopefully, there's a bit of companies grow up much like humans, and the company grows up and basically has that awkward conversation, or diverts them into an area of better effort.
Yeah, and there might be light at the end of the tunnel because quite often when a company does later funding rounds, so when if this person, the investor director, may have joined pre-seed, when they go to seed and certainly to Series A, those VCs will want to allocate their own investor director, and usually you have a flush out of existing kind of directors at that point in order to so that there aren't too many people sat at the table. So you could preserve them as an advisor if you wanted to do that, but you can kind of move them down the ranks so they're not as polluting.
I think in a previous episode we had actually our lawyer on, and they suggested actually one of the things that you can do is you can have like a threshold that someone has to hit in terms of ownership percentage in order to be an investor director.
Very typical. Yeah.
Which I think is a great idea. Okay, Sam, thank you so much for your sort of words of wisdom, insights, and unpacking these stories with me. Before we go, any last words of wisdom that you'd want to sort of impart to founders who are going through potentially tough situations out there?
What I would love to say is I wish we had more red cards on this episode, and also I'd love to do another episode on this is all about what the founders side. I've got some war stories on the investor side that are just outrageous. So yeah, I'd love to. If you ever do an episode on founders behaving badly, I'd love to bring some cards of my own to that.
We would love to have you back for that. Absolutely, yeah. Please, because it's so important. I think from a founder side to understand what's going through on the investor side to understand. Okay, here's what an investor's likely to be thinking.
Yeah, parting shot, I guess, is. Having been through this journey myself, like I say, it was a roller coaster. 0 to 30 million in 4 years feels like the dream. And some days it was, and some days it was the utter nightmare. And the thing I learned that I'd never realized, and I haven't felt it since actually, but during that business, everything feels so brittle every single day. You get a big win. It's like, yeah, we've just won a new customer. And then a key employee will leave, or you lose another customer, or a customer contract will be delayed by a month, or you won't get paid by a big invoice by a customer or whatever, and everything feels until you reach the exit. And actually, even an hour before the exit, it felt just so brittle up to that very point. So, and I didn't realize how emotionally brittle running a startup would feel. Now, obviously, I've had a material exit. I run a couple of startups now, and I'm much more. It'll be okay. But yeah, that's and that is. I'm sure lots of founders are feeling that, and it is natural to feel. Every day will be a roller coaster. Everything will be brittle, and that is just the way life's supposed to be as a startup founder. I'm afraid.
That definitely resonates. As you know, yeah. No, Sam, thank you so much for coming on, and yeah, it's been really a pleasure. I'm sure lots of our listeners will get some great value and insight from that.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.